Hi, I'm Jen Moore. I'm the program annotator for Music of the Baroque. I'm here today in my own personal lecture hall to discuss the second program in Music of the Baroque's 50th season, Double Trouble, featuring concertos for two violins by Antonio Vivaldi and Johann Sebastian Bach, and grand concertos by Arcangelo Corelli and George Frideric Handel. The soloists and co-directors for this program will be Music of the Baroque's co-assistant concertmasters, Kathleen Brauer and Kevin Case. In January, Music of the Baroque performed Vivaldi's complete four seasons, which is essentially just four separate violin concertos. And on February 28th, we have another program of concertos. The concerto is one of the most important types of compositions for instruments that emerged during the Baroque era, which we generally define as a period of music that started in 1600 with the birth of opera and ended around 1750 with the death of Johann Sebastian Bach. Instrumental music really came into its own during the Baroque. While previously instrumental music was used mostly for dance or to perform music written first for voices, in the Baroque era, composers started writing lengthy works for instruments alone. And the concerto, a multi-movement work for a single soloist or multiple soloists and an ensemble, really caught on. But what does concerto mean? In his work, the Syntagma Musicum, the composer and theorist Pretorius traces the genesis of concerto to concertare, or to contend or compete. Although the etymology of the genre evokes images of instruments sort of locked in heated duels, Pretorius goes on to explain that some listeners regarded the concerto as a form of harmonious contention. This nuance is vital. Although the concerto highlights difference between solo and ensemble, for example, it also relies heavily on unity. Soloists in a Baroque concerto generally perform as part of the orchestra too, and the orchestral parts and solo parts generally share significant amounts of musical material. The overall result is not a tug of war between soloist and orchestra, but rather a network of carefully woven textures and melodic repetition. Instead of a fight, a more fitting metaphor for the Baroque concerto might be intimate, even artful, conversation between equal partners. Along with the development of the concerto, the music on this program touches on a few other important themes in the Baroque era. Thanks to recordings and the internet, one click of a computer mouse or a simple "Hey Siri" grants us access to an infinite amount of music. In the 18th century, however, music had to be written down in order to circulate far beyond the space in which it was performed. Innovations in music printing made it increasingly possible for composers to disseminate their compositions across Europe. The concertos by Arcangelo Corelli, Antonio Vivaldi, and George Frideric Handel all came from printed collections that greatly influenced their peers. Sales of printed music also point toward another shift that began in the 18th century, the possibility of earning a living as a composer without being tied to private patrons. While Corelli, Vivaldi, and Bach were connected for the most part to specific institutions, Handel built his career in part on opera oratorios and even the precursor of the public orchestra concert. These are huge topics to which many articles and books have been devoted, and I can't do them justice in a short pre-concert talk, but I will touch on them briefly as I talk about each individual composition. The first piece the orchestra will perform is Arcangelo Corelli's Concerto Grosso in F major, Opus 6, No. 2. A little about Corelli first. Born in Italy in 1653, Corelli was known as both a violinist and a composer. After studying violin in the city of Bologna, Corelli moved to Rome and in 1689 became the first violinist and director of music to the newly appointed Cardinal Pietro Ottoboni. The cardinal required ensembles for many different purposes, and Corelli served essentially as a one-man department of artistic administration. He found performers, arranged for transportation, figured out the rehearsal schedule and who he conducted, and he made sure everyone was paid. And of course, he composed the music too. And the cardinal wasn't Corelli's only employer. From the early 1680s until the first decade of the 18th century, the composer led nearly every documented performance in Rome of an ensemble consisting of more than 10 musicians. Ultimately, Corelli established himself among his peers as a pioneer in instrumental music and one of the greatest musicians of his time. In spite of Corelli's importance, a relatively small number of his compositions exist today. Even though he is usually credited with inventing the Grand Concerto, or Concerto Grosso, for example, the only samples that we have of his today come from the 12 grand concertos contained in this Opus 6 collection, which themselves were not published until after his death in 1714. What does exist, however, is clear evidence that this music had a profound impact on Corelli's contemporaries and later generations of composers. One of the fundamental aspects of the Grand Concerto is the contrast between the soloist group, called the concertino, and the full orchestra, called the ripieno. In the Opus 6 collection, all of the concertos use a soloist group consisting of 2 violins and violoncello, which is usually abbreviated cello. The first 8 concertos in Corelli's collection are sonatas da chiesa, or church sonatas, a term that loosely refers to a multi-movement instrumental work with no dance movements, no minuets or gigues, for example, which you often see in Baroque instrumental music. While the name originated from their occasional use during church services, many church sonatas were simply written as entertainment and served no liturgical function. Corelli's Concerto in F major, Opus 6, No. 2, illustrates nicely the principle of sharp contrast so fundamental to the Baroque aesthetic, especially the distinction between solo and ensemble and slow-fast tempos. The first movement, for example, holds within it enough contrast that it's almost counterintuitive to label it as a discrete section. A fanfare-like opening leads into an imitative allegro, interrupted by a minor mode adagio, before the introduction and allegro return in a different key. The movement ends with a largo andante that flirts with a minor mode. The second and third movements cohere a little better, though I still wonder what benefit comes from describing this piece as consisting solely of 3 major movements. Let's listen to some of these dramatic changes that take place in the first movement alone, as well as the role the soloists play, as they emerge from and disappear into the entire ensemble. If Corelli was one of the concerto's pioneers, Antonio Vivaldi took the genre to the next level. Born in Venice, Vivaldi was educated in music, but he was ordained a priest in 1703. Although the job didn't stick, that, along with the fact that he had famously red hair, earned him the nickname the Red Priest. Around 1704, he began his association with the Ospedale della Pietà, a Venetian school for orphan girls that offered its residents room, board, and an excellent education in music. This creative outlet for women was especially important at a time when there was little opportunity for female musicians. And much of Vivaldi's compositional output was actually devoted to these talented players who performed regularly to the delight of visitors, performed from behind a screen to protect their modesty. While Vivaldi was well known as the result of his work with the Pietà, it was his first published set of concertos that established his reputation throughout Europe. Issued in 1711 and subtitled L'Estro Armonico, which loosely translates as The Harmonic Fancy, the collection was reprinted in London as Vivaldi's Most Celebrated Concertos, and it was also reprinted in Paris. The eighth concerto in the set, the Concerto for two violins in A minor, is written in the three-movement form that became standard. In comparison to Corelli's Concerto Grosso, in which the solo statements are relatively brief and are tightly interwoven with the orchestra, Vivaldi's Concerto in A minor showcases the two soloists much more prominently and for longer stretches, another feature that points in the direction the concerto eventually headed. We will hear exactly that direction in our March concert, in which Dame Jane Glover will join us for the first time this 50th season with pianist Inon Barnatan for Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 14. Let's listen to a little of Vivaldi's Concerto for two violins. I'd like to talk about two of the three movements. In the opening allegro, a strong opening theme in the orchestra paves the way for the soloists, who sometimes play an imitation and sometimes as melody and accompaniment for one another. Compare this in your mind to Corelli's Grand Concerto, in which the soloists are much more tightly integrated into the framework of the orchestra. After this opening allegro comes a much slower movement marked larghetto e spiritoso, rather slow and spirited. The soloists come completely to the foreground. There are lyrical statements bookended by a unison statement in the orchestra. This phrase, this unison phrase, is extremely important because it keeps repeating, slightly varied, throughout the entire movement, forming a musical foundation on which the soloists elaborate on top. This style of composition, melody and variations over a repeating line, is an important technique in Baroque instrumental music. Two examples of this would be the chaconne or the passacaglia. Those might be terms you've seen or heard before. They're both musical forms in which a repeating line, which often happens in the bass, grounds what's going on in the upper voices. Now let's hear a little bit of this larghetto e spiritoso. Before we leave Vivaldi behind, one of the ways we know he was an influential composer are the ways in which he was imitated. We know Johann Sebastian Bach knew this concerto, for example, because he arranged the entire thing for organ. Let's listen to a little bit of Bach's Concerto in A minor, BWV 593. Today, this might be a serious copyright issue. In the 18th century, however, the concept of authorship wasn't the same as ours, and it might have even been pretty high praise to have your music picked up by another composer. And now on to Handel. Handel was on the cutting edge of an innovation that revolutionized the classical music industry, the public concert. During the time Handel was in London, these events increasingly became part of the musical landscape. Handel's collection of 12 grand concertos, Opus 6, was likely among the repertoire performed regularly in these settings. Written in the fall of 1739 in the space of about a month, they are perhaps the best known of Handel's instrumental works, and Handel almost certainly had Corelli's Opus 6 collection in mind while working on his own. Handel was a savvy businessman, and this was a smart move. Corelli's concertos were instantly popular when published in England in 1714. 18th century historian Roger North later went so far as to dub them the bread of life. Along with sharing an opus number, in Handel's case, possibly a shrewd marketing tactic, both seem to have been conceived as organized collections and mostly use a solo group of 2 violins and cello. Many of Corelli's Opus 6 concertos have more than 3 movements, as do Handel's Opus 6 concertos. In spite of these superficial similarities, Handel's Opus 6 works exhibit a strong dramatic sense and feeling of narrative progression that is very much evident in the Concerto Grosso in E minor, Opus 6, number 3. The concerto consists of 5 very distinct movements. I'd like to focus on the 3rd movement, marked Allegro, and the 4th, a Polonaise, to show how Handel uses the distinction between solo ensemble in the service of a larger narrative. First, the brilliant Allegro, in which the soloists take a prominent role in directing the musical roadmap, leading effortlessly from one orchestral section to the next. Now, the heart of the concerto, an unabashedly joyful Polonaise, a dance historically rooted in carnival or folk wedding celebrations that the court gradually appropriated. The program concludes with the most famous of the 4 concertos, Johann Sebastian Bach's Concerto for 2 violins in D minor. Working tightly with courts and especially churches his entire career, Bach was in a somewhat different position than the other composers. While his music circulated in manuscripts or handwritten scores, very few of his compositions were published. The majority of what was printed were works for keyboard, creating a skewed image of him as a composer primarily of keyboard music, which of course is very far from the truth. Like Vivaldi, however, whose instrumental music is tied to the Pietà, Bach's music is strongly linked to the places where he worked. When scholars have tried to identify the provenance of the concerto for two violins, often called simply the Bach double, they generally turn to his different jobs for clues. Bach scholar Christoph Wolff has proposed that Bach wrote the work while in Leipzig, but most scholars agree that, like most of Bach's string music, the concerto probably dates from Bach's tenure at Curtin. Bach was offered the position of Kapellmeister at Curtin in December 1717, when he was just 32 and currently working in Weimar. The Duke of Weimar was reluctant to lose the composer, to say the least. When Bach tried to resign, he held him under arrest for an entire month. But the position at Curtin was irresistible. Bach would be the second highest paid court employee, and his wife, Maria Barbara, would be a salaried singer as well. Tragedy struck about 3 years after the move. His wife died, leaving him a single father. About a year later, Bach married Anna Magdalena, the daughter of the town trumpeter. Bach was not only a virtuoso keyboard player, he was also a relatively accomplished violinist. His son, Carl Philipp Emanuel, tells us, "From his youth up to fairly old age, he played the violin purely and with a penetrating tone, and thus kept the orchestra in top form, much better than he could have from the harpsichord. He completely understood the possibilities of all stringed instruments." The double concerto is an excellent example of Bach's facility with strings. Of all the works on this program, this is the one in which the soloists are showcased the most. Bach strikes a perfect balance between extroverted showmanship and idiomatic ease. The solo parts imitate each other incessantly. In fact, the parts only truly differ in that the first part is higher than the second, and their musical dialogue is the focal point of the entire piece. While the orchestra emerges occasionally to challenge the soloists, it serves primarily as the accompaniment. And in the second movement, the ensemble essentially plays the continuo part, providing understated accompaniment for the plaintive, heart-wrenching melodies of the solo violins. Let's listen to quick excerpts from all three movements that show off Bach's brilliant solo writing. One final note. All four of the works on this program were truly written with the performers in mind. It's intended to be technically challenging, and it is, but the musicians also have the challenge of remaining completely in sync without a conductor, truly playing as one in order to create seamless and tight transitions in the many exchanges between solo and ensemble. I encourage you to watch the way the performers communicate with one another and the symbiotic energy that results. I hope I've given you a few things to think about, especially the differences between each composer and what makes each special. And I hope you enjoy Double Trouble, streamed live on February 28th 7:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, and available on demand from March 3rd through April 3rd. Thank you so much.